Vietnam War 1955–1975. Vietnam War was a war fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam from the 1st of November 1955 to the Saigon Fall on 30 April 1975. It was a devastating conflict supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam supported by the United States of America. This war is widely considered to be a Cold War-era proxy war. It lasted about 20 years with the involvement of the USA ending in 1973. This war resulted in making all three countries communist states by 1975. In this article, we shall discuss in detail the Vietnam War, its background, causes and aftermaths, and associated myths. Read this article on decolonization. Overview. Highlights. Also called as Second Indochina War. Date the 1st of November, 1955, the 30th of April 1975. Participants United States of America. Location Vietnam. Major leaders: Ho Chi Minh, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Ngo Dinh Diem, Lyndon Johnson. Vietnam War 1955–1975. Historical background. The parties involved in the war were the Armed Forces of the United States of America, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the People's Army of Vietnam, and the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, the Communist Guerrilla Force of South Vietnam. The Indochina region had been under the control of the French from the late 19th century to mid-20th century. The country came under the control of the Japanese government during the breakout of World War II. This was opposed by the Viet Minh, Communist-led Common Front, along with the support of the USA, Soviet Union, and China. When Japan surrendered, some of its arms were taken over by the group. On the 2nd of September, under the leadership of Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. It ruled as the civil government in Vietnam for only 20 days when it was overthrown by the French forces on the 23rd of September 1945 and declared the restoration of French authority. Following this, the Viet Minh initiated an insurgency against French rule, and these hostilities escalated into the First Indochina War. By the 1950s, it merged with the Cold War. The Soviet Union and China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam of Viet Minh as the legitimate government. However, the French-backed state of Vietnam was backed by the United States and Britain. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 convinced the USA that the war was an example of the expansion of communism directed by the Soviet Union. The military advisors of China assisted the Viet Minh while the United States formed a military assistance and advisory group to oversee the French requests for aid, advice, and the training of the Vietnamese soldiers. In 1954, the French forces at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. This marked the end of French involvement in Indochina. Estimates of the number of casualties vary, with one source suggesting up to 3.8 million violent war deaths in Vietnam for the period 1955 to 2002. A detailed demographic study calculated 791,000 1,141,000 war-related deaths during the war for all of Vietnam, for both military and civilians. Between 195,000 and 430,000 South Vietnamese civilians died in the war. Extrapolating from a 1969 U.S. intelligence report, Ginter Louis estimated that 65,000 North Vietnamese civilians died in the war. Estimates of civilian deaths caused by the American bombing of North Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder range from 30,000 to 182,000. A 1975 U.S. Senate subcommittee estimated 1.4 million South Vietnamese civilian casualties during the war, including 415,000 deaths. The military forces of South Vietnam suffered an estimated 254,256 kills between 1960 and 1974, and additional deaths from 1954 to 1959 and in 1975. Other estimates point to higher figures of 313,000 casualties. The official U.S. Department of Defense figure was 950,765 PAVN/VC forces killed in Vietnam from 1965 to 1974. Defense Department officials believed that these body count figures need to be deflated by 30%. Ginter Louis asserts that 1/3 of the reported enemy killed may have been civilians, concluding that the actual number of deaths of PAVN/VC military forces was probably closer to 444,000. Learn about the French Revolution for the UPSC exam here. Cause of Vietnam War. The causes of the Vietnam War was derived from the consequences of the Cold War. One of the major reasons for the Vietnam War was the threat perception by the United States of America of the threat of communism across Southeast Asia. Apart from the above reason, the tensions which continued for decades also contributed to the war. For example, since the late 19th century, the country was controlled by France as part of its colonial empire. This foreign rule resulted in anger among the Vietnamese people and a sense of distrust toward the foreign powers. With the end of the Second World War, the region was under the dominance of Japan, however. Later it was defeated by the United States of America, and France, with help from the USA, attempted to gain control over Vietnam. This resulted in the rise of communist revolutionaries. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese independence movement, a fierce battle between France and Ho Chi Minh led to the defeat of France, and North Vietnam came under the control of Ho Chi Minh. In Geneva, at a conference in 1954, Vietnam was divided by the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was under the control of communists and South Vietnam came under the control of Ngo Dinh. Diem. South Vietnam was supported by Western democracies while North Vietnam was under communist influence. South Vietnam was ruled like a dictator country when tension between North and South Vietnam intensified. The United States of America was in favor of the Ngo Diem regime as the United States was aiming at stopping the spread of communism in the South Pacific region. However, the rule of Diem was less liked by people. With the passage of time, the control of the USA over Vietnam increased militarily, especially under the presidency of John F. Kennedy. In 1963, the rule of Diem was overthrown and unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated. He was replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who increased the influence of the USA in Vietnam. Johnson was well determined to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. The interference of the United States increased particularly after the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964. Also, check World History UPSC notes here. Who all were involved in the Vietnam War? The parties involved in the Vietnam War were reasons for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The reasons for the involvement of the United States of America in the Vietnam War are as follows. The United States of America wanted Vietnamese independence. During the Second World War, Vietnam came under the control of Japan. It was Ho Chi Minh who took control over Hanoi in 1945 and declared Vietnam independent. There was an attempt to unite the country under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The United States of America felt that if a country falls under the grip of communism, it is likely that the neighboring country may also tilt towards communism. The U.S. felt that communism would spread to South Vietnam and ultimately to the whole of Asia. There was an attack on the U.S. Navy destroyer by North Vietnam, which was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. This was used as an excuse by the U.S. to intervene in the Vietnam War. Check out this article on Napoleon Bonaparte here. Major leaders and their roles in the Vietnam War. Major leader involved in the war were Ho_Chi_Minh. He was influenced by his father's involvement in the campaign to free Vietnam from France. He visited Europe and the United States and was horrified by the devastation which was caused by World War I and thus sought to eradicate the Western influence from the Indo-China region. However, unsuccessful attempts made him tilt towards communist ideologies. Later, established the Vietnam Revolutionary Youth League, which was known as the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. Kennedy wanted to stop the expansion of communism in Vietnam. Though was against the deployment of U.S. forces in large numbers in Vietnam, he was in favor of using special forces for counterinsurgency warfare in third world countries that were threatened by communism. He initiated the Strategic Hamlet Program in 1961. It attempted to reset all the rural population of Vietnam into fortified villages and segregate the South Vietnamese into new communities. However, the program ended in failure in 1964. Also, check the Protestant Reformation, beginning, expansion and impacts. End of Vietnam War. The American troops began their withdrawal to ease the public sentiments under the leadership of Nixon. The final agreement between North Vietnam and the United States was reached in 1973. However, the war between North and South Vietnam continued. It concluded on April 30, 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Many civilians in fear of being persecuted left the country. Agent Orange, which was used in the war, led to birth defects among children. Although the United States' direct involvement in the war ended, fighting between the two Vietnamese forces continued. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to Northern forces on April 30, 1975, and the country was unified as a communist country. Around 3 million Vietnamese people, 300,000 Cambodians, 60,000 Laotians, and 58,220 American military personnel were estimated to have died. In 1976, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. In 1986, the communist country began political and economic reforms that helped Vietnam gradually integrate into the global economy. In 2007, it became a member of the World Trade Organization (WTO). What are some myths about the Vietnam War? Some common myths associated with the Vietnam War are: the war was fought mostly by draftees. The bombing of North Vietnam was just a terror weapon and it had no impact. The U.S. lost the Vietnam War. The U.S. Army crucified women and children in villages of Vietnam. Also, read Sykes-Picot Agreement here. Lessons from the war. While the Democrats in the U.S. could build up public opinion in the U.S. and the Allied countries against the war to which the U.S. government had to succumb, the totalitarian communist regimes did not face this problem. Secondly, there was an increased realization that the deliberative approach works only if there are sufficient grounds for offering and receiving benefits, that is, both parties are almost on equal footing and are in a position to offer and receive something, and would not work if either party realizes that it is in a position to dominate and could hence dictate terms of the settlement. Also, read this article on Jacobins. Conclusion: the Vietnam War ended up in reunification in 1976. However, it did not bring an end to the conflict. In the subsequent years, South Vietnam witnessed greater economic growth.